In 1982, a man walking through an orchard about 2 kilometers from this path found a tree that had been marked for destruction. It was a leftover from an experiment nobody believed in anymore. He decided to give it one more year. That tree was the Honeycrisp apple, and it went on to earn the University of Minnesota millions and change what the world expects an apple to taste like. This is where that happened. We are near Chaska in Carver County, Minnesota in the United States, about 40 kilometers southwest of Minneapolis. This is the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, 1,200 acres of gardens, collections and restored natural land belonging to the University of Minnesota. And about 1.5 miles west of it sits the Horticultural Research Center, which is where the actual breeding happens. 2 places, 1 project, making plants that can survive here. Because that is the whole idea, and it is easy to miss. An arboretum in a mild climate can plant more or less whatever it likes. An arboretum in Minnesota cannot. It exists because in this state, most of what the gardening world sells you simply dies. Everything you are looking at is either something that survived a test or something being tested right now. This is not a park with plants in it. It is a laboratory that happens to be beautiful. Start with why the ground here is the way it is. The last ice sheet covered this country and then withdrew, and the lobe that mattered in this part of Minnesota came up out of the southwest, grinding across the prairie. It dumped its load as it went. Gray clay, sand, gravel, boulders hauled from hundreds of kilometers away. When it was gone, it left rolling ground, wet hollows, and in some places, extraordinary deposits of clay. Just south of us, the Minnesota River runs through a valley that is far too big for it, cut by an enormous glacial meltwater river when Lake Agassiz drained. Chaska sits on that river. The soils here are glacial in origin and they are good, and that combination of a navigable river, deep soil, and a particular kind of clay is why there is a town at all. The town was, for 100 years, made of the ground it stood on. The clay under Chaska fires to a pale cream color, not red. That is unusual, and it is a matter of chemistry, a low iron content in the deposit. German settlers arrived here with the knowledge to work it, and there was hardwood forest right next to it for fuel, and a river to carry the product away. 3 ingredients in the same place. That is not luck exactly, but it is close. So the Brickyards started in 1857, and at the peak there were 8 of them. In 1910 alone, they turned out about 40 million cream-colored bricks. Chaska Brick went into the Minnesota state capitol, into the Minneapolis flour mills, into Fort Snelling, into Stillwater Prison. Before the railroads came in 1872, the bricks went out by steamboat and barge. A whole city's economy, built out of what the glacier happened to leave behind. It ran until about 1950, and then it was over. Concrete block and cheaper transport killed it. But go into old Chaska and the town is still visibly made of itself. Pale cream walls, that soft yellow-white color on street after street. A local material makes a local architecture, and when the material runs out or stops paying, the buildings become the last record of it. The clay pits are quiet now. The forest around all of this had a name. The Big Woods, or in the French of the traders, the Grand Bois. A dense, closed hardwood forest of maple, basswood, elm, and oak that ran for something over 3,000 square miles across south-central Minnesota. In 1851, a man named Thomas Holmes came up the Minnesota River and noticed a 20-acre clearing in that forest, and he claimed it, and that clearing became Chaska. The Big Woods was cut and cleared with astonishing speed. Roughly 1% of it now survives, in fragments. Some of the woodland in this arboretum and the remnants nearby are part of what is left of it. Standing inside a mature maple and basswood stand is the closest anyone can now come to seeing what most of this county looked like before 1850. It is a very small window on a very large thing. This is Dakota homeland. Ojibwe people are also present across this region. The Big Woods sat inside a seasonal round, maple sugaring in early spring, hunting in the forest, fishing and gathering on the river and the lakes. The Dakota are living peoples with communities and governments in Minnesota today, in the present tense. The land this arboretum stands on came into other hands through the treaties of the 1850s, and that is simply the fact of it. Maple sugaring is the oldest agriculture in this forest, and it is worth noticing that it is the same idea as everything else we are going to talk about today. You watch a plant closely for generations. You learn exactly when it will do the thing you need. You take what it gives, and you take it in a way that lets you come back next year. Long before there was a research station here, that knowledge was already in these woods. Now the problem this whole institution exists to solve. Minnesota winters, temperatures that fall to 30 and 40 below zero Fahrenheit. Wood freezes and splits. Flower buds die in the bud. Roots freeze in ground with no snow cover on it. The apple varieties that Europeans and Easterners brought with them, the ones bred for New York and for England, mostly just died here, and they kept dying year after year for decades. Imagine what that actually looked like on the ground. A settler puts in an orchard. It takes years to come into bearing. Then one hard winter kills the lot and the family starts again or gives up on fruit altogether. That was the ordinary experience of horticulture in this state in the 19th century. Minnesota was widely considered a place where you simply could not grow a decent apple. That belief was reasonable, and it was very hard to shift. In 1853, a man named Peter Gideon came to Minnesota from Ohio with his wife and settled on the shore of Lake Minnetonka, not far north of here. Over 14 years he planted, seeded and grafted more than 10,000 trees. Apple, cherry, peach, pear, plum, quince. Hard winters killed them. Blight killed them. Grasshoppers came. By the end of it, he was down to almost nothing, and by most accounts nearly destitute. The story that has come down is that with his last money he sent away to Maine for apple seeds. One of those seedlings, crossed with a Siberian crab apple, survived. Siberian crab is brutally cold hardy, and that is the whole point. He grew it out. It made fruit. It came through the winters. And in 1868, after 15 years of failure, Gideon had an apple that would live in Minnesota. He named it the Wealthy, after his wife, wealthy Hull Gideon. It became the most popular apple in the upper Midwest, and it went on to be a parent of other varieties. Gideon never made money from it. He had no patent and no protection, and the idea of owning a plant variety barely existed. He gave the state its first proof that this could be done at all, and he died a poor man. Sit with the arithmetic of that. 10,000 trees planted, and one that worked. 15 years of a man's life and one apple. That ratio is not an accident of Gideon's bad luck. It is roughly what fruit breeding actually costs, and every institution that came after him has had to plan around it. Everything the University of Minnesota has done since is essentially an attempt to run Peter Gideon's experiment at scale and with a salary. Which is what happened. The university had begun breeding work in 1878, dropped it, and then in 1908 the state established a fruit breeding farm out here in the country west of Minneapolis, near Excelsior and Victoria. Its purpose was blunt and specific: create fruit of good quality that will survive a Minnesota winter. That farm is now called the Horticultural Research Center, and it is still working, a mile and a half from this path. Its first superintendent was Charles Haralson. What he and his successors set up was an industrial version of what Gideon had done by hand: make thousands of deliberate crosses, plant out the seedlings, wait years for them to fruit, and then throw almost all of them away. The work is mostly rejection. A breeding program is a machine for saying no about 10,000 times in order to say yes once. In 1922, the farm released an apple named for Charles Haralson himself. The Haralson is tart, firm, and it stores. It is the classic Minnesota baking apple, and it stayed the #1 apple in this state for more than 50 years. If you meet an older Minnesotan with strong opinions about pie, they are probably opinions about the Haralson. It was the proof that the program worked. Go and look at a breeding orchard and it does not look like an orchard. It looks like an archive. Row upon row of young trees, each one genetically unique, each one a single throw of the dice, each one tagged with a number rather than a name. Nobody knows what any of them tastes like until it fruits, and that can take 4 to 6 years. Every tree in that field is a question that has not been answered yet. Because apples do not breed true. Plant a seed from a Honeycrisp and you do not get a Honeycrisp. You get something new and almost certainly worse. Every apple variety on Earth is a single individual tree, cloned by grafting, sometimes for centuries. So a breeder takes pollen from one variety, puts it on the flower of another by hand, grows out the seeds, and then tastes every one of the children. The act itself is almost absurdly small. You open a blossom before it has opened itself. You remove its anthers so it cannot pollinate itself. You touch pollen from the chosen father onto its stigma with a brush and you bag it. Then you wait. That gesture, done a few thousand times in a spring, is the source of every apple in this story. Enormous consequences from something you could do with a paintbrush. In 1960, at the Horticultural Research Center at Victoria, a researcher named Cecil Stushnoff made a cross. The seedling that came out of it was given a number, MN 1711. It was one of thousands. It went into the ground with the others and it grew, and for years it was of no particular interest to anyone. The people who made it did not know what it was. That is normal. That is the job. And here is the thing about the number. MN 1711 was not a name. It was an inventory tag on a tree that would probably be cut down. Most of them are. The breeding orchard is culled hard because land and labor are finite, and a tree that has not produced anything remarkable within a few years of fruiting is taking up a space that a new cross could use. The system is designed to destroy its own failures. In 1976, winter storms badly damaged the original MN 1711 tree and it was discarded. But clones of it had already been grafted and planted elsewhere on the station and forgot. In 1979, David Bedford joined the program. In 1982, going through trees marked for removal, he came across one of those forgotten clones. He pulled it out of the cull list and gave it one more season. Everything after this point rests on that single decision, made by one person on an ordinary working day, about a tree with a number on it. There is no drama in the archive, just a man with a clipboard in a field deciding that this one was worth another year. It is the most consequential act of horticultural stubbornness in the history of this state, and at the time it was nothing at all. It fruited and it was extraordinary. In 1988, Bedford and Jim Luby patented it and gave it a name, Honeycrisp. In 1991, it was released to Minnesota growers. It reached grocery shelves around 1996, and then it did something no university apple had ever done. It escaped Minnesota entirely, and it went on to be planted in Washington State, in Europe, in New Zealand. What people noticed was the texture, not just crisp, explosive. A Honeycrisp does not yield, it shatters, and it floods your mouth with juice. It is the reason people started paying 2 and 3 times the price of an ordinary apple without complaining. And the odd thing is that the texture is not a matter of flavor chemistry at all. It is a matter of the physical architecture of the fruit. Here is the mechanism. The cells in a Honeycrisp are unusually large, noticeably larger than in a standard variety, with thin walls and high internal pressure. When you bite an ordinary apple, the flesh tends to fail along the boundaries between cells. The cells slide apart, intact. When you bite a Honeycrisp, the cells themselves rupture. They burst. That is the crunch, and that is why the juice arrives all at once. It is a genuinely lovely piece of plant physiology. The apple is not sweeter than its rivals by any dramatic margin. It simply delivers what it has in a different way, all at once, in a series of tiny explosions. Nobody set out to breed that. Bedford and Luby did not design a cell wall. They tasted a very large number of apples and kept the one that behaved strangely, and the explanation came afterwards. In 2006, Minnesota made the Honeycrisp its official state fruit, and it was named by the technology transfer community as one of 25 innovations that changed the world. The patent expired in 2008. Even so, the University of Minnesota is reported to have earned something on the order of $16 million in royalties by 2019, largely through licensing overseas. A public university funded by a fruit. Think about what that money represents. Public land grant research, done slowly, over decades on a budget, with no guarantee of anything, producing an object that ended up in supermarkets on 3 continents. This is the argument for patient public science in one apple. Nobody could have written a business case for MN 1711 in 1960. Nobody could have written one in 1982 either, standing in front of the Cull Pile. And there is a final twist. For years, the record said Honeycrisp was a cross of Macon and Honeygold. In 2004, DNA testing showed that was wrong. The real parents were not known. It took until 2017 to work it out. One parent is Keepsake, another Minnesota variety. The other is MN 1627, a selection that was never released, never named, and is now, as far as anyone can tell, gone. So the world's most valuable apple has a parent that no longer exists, and whose only surviving trace is in the genome of its child. Behind those two, the ancestry runs back to Golden Delicious and to Duchess of Oldenburg, an old Russian variety that came into this country precisely because it was cold hardy. The line that produced Honeycrisp is, in the end, a line of survival. That is what it was selected for from the beginning. And it did not stop. Zestar came out in 1999, an early season apple. Sweet Tango is a cross of Honeycrisp and Zestar. First Kiss, known as MN55, crosses Honeycrisp with an early southern variety to get that texture ripe by early September, which matters enormously in a short northern season. This state has released dozens of apple varieties, and the modern ones are almost all descended from that one rescued tree. The same logic runs through everything here. Cold, hardy wine grapes, bred here since the 1970s, varieties like Frontenac, Marquette, and Itasca, tough enough to carry a full crop after temperatures of 30 below. Deciduous azaleas of the Northern Lights series, released from 1978, bred for flower buds that survive a Minnesota February. Whole industries in this state exist because somebody spent 20 years making plants that do not die. The Arboretum itself began in 1958 on 160 acres bought with money raised by Garden Club women, with Leon Snyder as its first director. It is 1,200 acres now. It holds a prairie planted in 1968, one of the earliest constructed prairies anywhere, and a sedge meadow restored on an old drained cornfield. Gardens at the front, research behind, restored wild land at the back. That is the whole institution in one sentence. And it comes back to the same idea every time. Somebody plants 10,000 things, knowing that almost all of them will fail and waits. A man loses his orchards for 15 years and gets one apple. Another man looks at a tree on a cull list and gives it one more season. Places like this are what patience looks like when it is institutionalized. Thank you for watching. Follow for more trails of the world.